Welcome to Donc Voilà Quoi, the podcast where history, culture, and activism collide. I'm your host, Jessie Louise, writer, speaker, and relentless questioner of the status quo. Here, we dig deep into the stories that shape our world, connecting the past to the present and challenging dominant narratives. From historical deep dives and cultural critiques, this is a space for critical thinking and meaningful conversations. So if you're ready to explore the overlooked, the forgotten, and the truths hidden in plain sight, you're in the right place. Let's get started. The Middle East, often called the graveyard of empires. It's a region that has seen countless powers rise and fall, each believing they could dominate it forever. In this episode, we're going to trace that long and well-documented history. From the ancient Egyptian campaign Kadesh, to the Crusaders, to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right up to modern-day American support for Israel. Every campaign had the same ambition, control, and yet each one encountered the same outcome: resistance. The peoples of the Levant and the wider region refused to be subdued. So why has this land, time and again, thwarted the ambitions of even the strongest empires? That's the question we're going to explore today. If you would like to read a written version of this episode, you can find it on my website, Donc Voilà Quoi, where you'll also discover more of my articles and essays. Our story begins with Sargon of Akkad, way back in the 24th century BCE. Now, Sargon is a fascinating figure. He started life as a cupbearer, not exactly what you'd expect for someone who became history's first empire builder. But through strategy, military might, and a fair bit of ruthlessness, he forges the Akkadian Empire, stretching across Mesopotamia and pushing into the Levant. On paper, it looks unstoppable. For the first time, the scattered city-states of Sumer are pulled together under a single rule. The idea of empire is born here. But here's the thing. Territory is far easier to seize than it is to hold. The Levant is not a blank canvas. It's a mosaic of deserts, mountains, rivers, tribes, and languages, all interwoven. Sargon's empire is constantly tested by rebellions, uprisings, and outside pressures, and within a few short generations, it collapses. By the time of his grandson, the empire is fractured and vulnerable. The Guetians, mountain people from the Zagros, sweep in and bring the whole project to an end. So even at the very dawn of empire, the lesson is already clear. The Middle East cannot be held by force alone. Fast forward several centuries and we come to another empire builder, Ramses II of Egypt, one of the most famous pharaohs of all time. In 1274, Ramses leads his army north to Kadesh, a crucial city on the Orontes River at the crossroads of today's Syria. His goal? To wrest control of the Levant from the Hittites, another superpower of the age. Egyptian inscriptions carved into stone for posterity tell us Ramses fought heroically, almost single-handedly, and turned the tide of battle. It's propaganda, of course. The reality is much less glamorous. The Battle of Kadesh ends in a stalemate. Neither side manages to decisively defeat the other. But the message is the same as with Sargon. Conquest doesn't guarantee control. Egypt could win battles, yes, but could it hold the Levant permanently? No. In the years that follows, Ramses was forced into something extraordinary for the time: a peace treaty with the Hittites, the earliest we know of in recorded history. It wasn't written out of goodwill or generosity. It was written because both empires understood their limits. Even for Ramses the Great, a man deified in life, worshipped as a god-king, the Levant was not his to rule. Now let's leap ahead to the 4th century BCE and the rise of Alexander of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great. By this point, the Persian Empire controls much of the region. Alexander sweeps through with astonishing speed. He takes Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the great cities of the ancient world, one after another. His empire stretches further than anyone before him could have dreamed possible. But here's where things start to unravel. Alexander isn't just conquering, he's trying to blend worlds together. He marries Persian nobles, he adopts elements of local dress and ceremony. He expects his Macedonian soldiers and generals to follow his lead, but they don't like it. To them, he's supposed to be the Greek conqueror, not a king who bows to Persian customs. Tensions build within his own ranks, and further east, into what is now Afghanistan and beyond, Alexander meets fierce resistance. Guerrilla fighters who know the terrain, who know how to vanish into the mountains, make his victories costly and incomplete. His dream of uniting East and West never truly takes hold. When Alexander dies suddenly in Babylon at just 32 years old, his empire fractures almost immediately. His generals carve it into pieces, each taking a share. The grand vision of one world under one crown dissolves. And again, the Middle East has the final say. Even the so-called great cannot bend it fully to his will. Jump forward more than 1,000 years, and the stage is set for another wave of would-be conquerors, the Crusaders. In 1099, European knights arrive in the Holy Land under the banner of Christ. Their goal is simple: to seize Jerusalem and secure it for Christendom. And at first, they succeed. The Crusaders capture Jerusalem in a brutal campaign, establishing Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast. And for a time, it looks as though Europe has planted itself firmly in the Levant. Castles rise, trade flows, and Western lords carve out territories for themselves. But the region is not theirs to keep. Muslim powers regroup. Local leaders rally under the banner of Islam. The most famous from among them is Salah ad-Din, who unites factions that have been divided and drives a powerful counterattack. Slowly but surely, the Crusaders are pushed back. They lose Jerusalem. They cling to coastal fortresses for a while longer, but their project is unsustainable. They are too far from home, too few in number, and disconnected from the land and its people. By 1291, it's all over. The last Crusader stronghold at Acre falls, and with it, the dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the Middle East. So what began with blood and zeal ended in retreat and failure. Once again, the Levant proves itself resistant to outside domination. Now, let's move into the modern era, with a name that everyone knows: Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1798, Napoleon sails into Egypt, bringing not just soldiers, but also scientists and scholars. His mission isn't only military, it's cultural, political, and even scientific. He wants to bring the so-called Enlightenment to the East, while also striking a blow against Britain's empire by cutting off its trade route to India. At first, things go well. Napoleon defeats the Mamluks in battle and establishes a foothold, but victory on the battlefield doesn't equal control of a country. The people resist. Cairo rises in rebellion. Napoleon crushes the revolt with brutal force, but the unrest never really ends. Still ambitious, he marches into Syria. And here's where the dream collapses. At the fortress city of Acre, Ottoman defenders, backed by the British Navy, stop him in his tracks. His forces are battered by disease, heat, and sheer exhaustion. Cut off from reinforcements, trapped by geography and local resistance, Napoleon is forced to abandon his Syrian campaign. He retreats into Egypt and eventually slips back to France, leaving his army behind. It's a humiliating setback. Napoleon, one of the greatest military minds of Europe, learns the same lesson that Sargon, Ramses, and Alexander had learned before him. The Middle East does not bend easily to foreign rule. After the First World War, the map of the Middle East was redrawn. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled vast parts of the region for centuries, collapses, and the so-called victors of war carve up its lands under the guise of mandates. France takes Syria and Lebanon, believing they can bring order, progress, and control. On paper, it looks straightforward. Europe holds the power, the technology, the money. But the reality is far from simple. The Syrians resist almost immediately. In the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925, villages rise, fighters strike, and rebellion spreads from the countryside to the cities. The French respond with force, bombing Damascus itself. Yet the resistance refuses to die. Over the next 2 decades, France struggles to maintain its grip. Every attempt to impose authority is met with opposition. Every move towards control is undermined by the people's determination to rule themselves. By 1946, it's over. The French are forced to withdraw, and Syria declares independence. Another empire learns the same hard lesson. Military occupation may last for years, even decades, but it cannot erase the will of the people rooted in their own land and history. Now we come to the British Empire, at the height of its global power in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Britain, ruling over vast territories from India to Africa, sees the Middle East as both a prize and a pathway. Control here means access to trade routes, to resources, and to strategic dominance. Just like those before them, the British soon discover that ambition doesn't guarantee success. In Afghanistan, they suffer one of the most humiliating defeats in imperial history. During the First Anglo-Afghan War, an entire British column, thousands of soldiers and camp followers, is wiped out during the retreat from Kabul in 1842. Out of the whole force, only one man makes it back alive to tell the story. Elsewhere, Britain tries to exert influence in Persia and across the Arabian Peninsula, but alliances prove fragile, tribal dynamics shift constantly, and the British find themselves caught in webs of resistance they cannot fully control. Even with advanced technology, modern armies, and global wealth behind them, the British discover what Sargon, Ramses, Alexander, and Napoleon had all faced before. The Middle East refuses to be subdued. Each failure chips away at Britain's image of invincibility, and in time, like every empire before it, the British project in the region begins to unravel. By the late 20th century, another superpower steps into the same trap: the Soviet Union. In 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Officially, it's to support a struggling communist government that's losing control. In reality, it's an attempt to expand influence and secure the region under Moscow's orbit. At first, the Soviets believe they can manage it. They have tanks, helicopters, modern weaponry. They're a Cold War giant. What could stand in their way? The answer comes quickly: the Afghan people. Local fighters, known as the Mujahideen, launch relentless resistance. They know the mountains, the valleys, the terrain that swallows foreign armies whole. They strike hard and they vanish, frustrating a conventional army that never seems to know where their enemy will appear next. And of course, the Mujahideen don't stand alone. They're supplied with weapons and funding from abroad, especially from the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, turning Afghanistan into a Cold War battlefield. What was supposed to be a quick operation drags on for nearly a decade. The Soviet soldiers are demoralized, casualties climb, and back home, the war becomes deeply unpopular. By 1989, the Soviets withdraw, bloodied, exhausted, and humiliated. Just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself would collapse. Afghanistan had once again lived up to its reputation as the graveyard of empires, and this time it helped to bring down a superpower. And then, of course, we arrive at the United States, the latest empire to test its strength in the Middle East. After the attacks of September the 11th, 2001, the US launches what it calls the War on Terror. American forces invade Afghanistan, topple the Taliban, and then, just 2 years later, invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein. The goals are sweeping: destroy terrorist networks, spread democracy, reshape the Middle East into something stable, safe, and aligned with American interests. But the reality is far messier. In Afghanistan, the Taliban regroup and return stronger than before. In Iraq, sectarian violence tears the country apart. The promise of democracy dissolves into insurgency, corruption, and chaos. Trillions of dollars are spent, countless lives are lost, and yet control slips further out of reach. By 2001, when US forces finally withdraw from Kabul, the world watches in disbelief. Images of helicopters over the embassy recall the fall of Saigon decades earlier. The Taliban are back in power. 2 decades of war. And what remains? The same lesson empires before had learned. Overwhelming military power cannot secure lasting domination in the Middle East. The US, like the Soviets, the British, the Crusaders, discovers that ambition is not enough. The land resists. The people endure. And occupation only sows the seeds of eventual retreat. And finally, we come to the most enduring and unresolved struggle of all: Israel and Palestine. Since 1948, when the State of Israel was declared, this land has been a site of constant conflict. Backed heavily by US military, political, and economic support, Israel has sought not just to exist, but to dominate the region, to secure itself through force, through occupation, through control. But just as with every empire before it, resistance never disappears. It rises in waves: the intifadas, the ongoing protests, the political movements, and the everyday refusal of Palestinians to surrender their land, their identity, or their dignity. Israel may hold overwhelming military power, but what it cannot extinguish is the will of the people bound deeply to their home. The more walls are built, the more checkpoints imposed, the more lives taken, the more resilient that identity becomes. And so even today, this conflict remains unresolved. Decade after decade, peace talks collapse, settlements expand, and yet the Palestinian resistance continues. When we place Israel's struggle in the long line of empires, from Sargon to Ramses, from Alexander to Napoleon, from the Soviets to the Americans, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The Levant has never been a land that submits quietly. It resists occupation, it resists domination, and in the end, it buries the ambitions of those who try. So what do we learn when we step back and look across this vast timeline? From Sargon's Akkadians to Ramses of Egypt, from Alexander the Great to Napoleon, from the Crusaders to the Soviets, and the British to the Americans, and now the Israelis, we see the same story repeating itself again and again. The Middle East resists, always. But why? First, the people. This region isn't just territory on a map. It's home to communities that are deeply tied to their land, their culture, their faith, and their histories. You can march in with an army, you can draw new borders, you can declare yourself the ruler, but you cannot erase that identity. And it's that identity that fuels resistance, even when the odds seem impossible. Second, the geography itself. The Middle East is a patchwork of deserts, mountains, fertile valleys, and ancient cities. It's landscape that defies simple conquest. Supply lines stretch thin, armies tire, climates overwhelm. Invaders who think in terms of maps and campaigns quickly discover that the land itself becomes an adversary. Third, the cultural and political complexity. This is not a homogeneous region. It's a mosaic of languages, tribes, faiths, and local loyalties. Empires often assume they can impose a single system on all of it. In reality, every imposition sparks new fractures, new rebellions, and new movements of resistance. And finally, hubris, the arrogance of empire. Every invading power has believed they were different. They had the technology, the strategy, or the ideology to succeed where others had failed. And yet, history shows us the pattern is ironclad. The greater the hubris, the harder the fall. When we put all of this together, the conclusion is unavoidable. The Middle East is not simply a graveyard of empires because of some unlucky streak in history. It's a region that actively resists domination. It breaks armies. It erodes occupations. It exposes the limits of power. And that is why, time and again, it has proven indomitable. So let's bring this full circle. From the Akkadians to the Egyptians, from Alexander to the Crusaders, from Napoleon to the French, from the British to the Soviets, from America to Israel today, the pattern is unmistakable. Empires arrive with overwhelming confidence. They see the Middle East as territory to be claimed, a resource to be exploited, crossroads to be controlled. But what they find is something they could never account for: the stubborn, rooted resilience of the people and the land itself. Geography resists, culture resists, identity resists, and together they expose the weakness at the heart of every empire, the belief that power alone can bend history to its will. That's why the Middle East has earned the name the graveyard of empires. Not because of chance, not because of misfortune, but because domination here is always a losing game. And that brings us to the present. The American-Israeli project in Palestine is not an exception to this rule. It is simply the latest chapter in a story as old as empire itself. No amount of force, no wall, no technology can erase a people's will to exist on their own land. History shows us that suppression only creates the conditions for resistance. So the real question is not whether the occupation can succeed. History's already answered that. The question is, how much destruction, how much suffering, how much human cost will be piled up before the inevitable truth is accepted that the Middle East cannot be conquered. That brings us to the end of this episode of Donc Voilà Quoi. We've traced the long and brutal history of empire after empire trying and failing to dominate the Middle East, only to meet the same inevitable fate. The resilience of the region and its people remains unmatched. As history has shown time and time again, no foreign power has ever truly conquered it. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to dive deeper into the full article on the topic, available on my website at doncvolaquoi.com. There you'll also find my latest works, including writing, book and film reviews, documentary recommendations, and thought-provoking essays that challenge conventional narratives and explore the complexities of our world. To continue the conversation, be sure to follow me on social media at Jessie Louise Vernon, where I share insights, updates, and engage with listeners like you. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and share it. Your support helps spread the discussion and keeps independent thought alive. And of course, I'll be back with another episode of Donc Voilà Quoi, where we'll dive into yet another fascinating topic. Until then, keep your eyes on the website, stay curious, and always keep questioning, keep learning, and keep resisting the forces that seek to rewrite history. If you'd like to reach out, you can connect with me via my social media or through my website. I always love hearing from you. Until next time, take care, and remember, a woman's place is in the resistance.
The red sun rose this morning. Dark skies pronounce your warning. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Hold on, the floor is caving. Your walls turn into cages. Your refuge will be your demise. Dances with the devil. Your power isn't special. We don't fit on your canvas. We burn it all to ashes now. 'Cause we